Good afternoon, Dr. Clements, and to anybody else that might be watching. My name is Emiliano Pittick. Today we're going to be talking about African Americans and workplace diversity. Without further ado, let's get started. So here's an introduction as to what I'm going to be talking about today. We're going to go over some key facts and interesting facts, as well as some statistics, the history of African Americans, population, education, employment, and earnings, stereotypes, strengths, strategies for individual and organizations to employ diversity, as well as popular culture and media representation. So to begin, there's actually been, as history might suggest, quite a bit of movement towards progress for Black people. On this image, you'll see many inspirational key figures from Malcolm X to Kendrick Lamar. Very important inspirational leaders that helped move the progressive policies that have led us to where we are today. Obviously, there is some work to be done, but there has been a significant movement for civil rights for Black people, despite some opposition from even figures like the FBI. Now, something that people might not be aware of is that the FBI actually sent MLK a letter basically blackmailing him to kill himself, or in a very suggestive and subtle way, which is very interesting, and it just goes to show that even though what might be the public opinion that Black people should have more rights, there are some people at the top that are very much against that. And there's one quote that really struck me at the end of this letter that you'll see here, which is kind of small to read, but you can find it online. It ends with, "King, there is only one thing left for you to do. You know what it is. You have just 34 days." Now here's some interesting statistics about Black people or African Americans. Is that the population is relatively young. The median age in 22 was found to be 32.1 years for African Americans, whereas the overall, national average was, or the median, I should say, was 38 years. New York City has more African Americans than any other metropolitan area, totaling around 3.6 million people. But Atlanta has the largest percentage of African Americans at 36% compared to other populations, according to the Pew Research Center. The African American population is ever growing, showing a population growth of 32% from 2000 to 2022, growing from 36.2 million to 47.9 million. And with that, we're going to briefly go over the history of civil rights for African Americans. In 1619, the first African was sold, and while some whites were also slaves, they were actually freed, while, obviously African Americans were not. For 146 years, this was the status quo. Until 1863, slavery was formally outlawed. African Americans did not have the same rights as white people, far from it. In 1865, they were subjected to segregation, which is a separate but supposedly equal institutional segregation, for lack of a better term, that separated Black and white people. It was so far from equal. It was enforced by Jim Crow laws based in prejudice and pseudoscience. In the 1930s and up until the 1960s, and to an extent even today, there is a thing called redlining, where the Federal Housing Authority discriminated against Blacks as a, quote, infiltration of inharmonious racial groups. That's what they described them, unquote. And they would conclude no loans for housing towards African Americans that were ethically sound and economically sound, but they didn't want to do it, leading to redlining. So they would segregate neighborhoods effectively. And then in 1964, the Civil Rights Act came. It prohibited race-based discrimination, but wealth inequality persists. Obviously, there's generational wealth, but there's also generational poverty. And that's what happened to African Americans. They had nothing. They started with nothing. They were slaves, and that continued for generations, while the dominant group just grew and grew in power, right? And up until today, we still have our own systemic, racism that is not legally required, but it's still prevalent. Private entities continue to practice redlining, housing associations. Um, Politicians engage in gerrymandering, which should be illegal. I don't know how that's still a thing. And blacks are still subjected to access and treatment discrimination. And with that very brief history, we're going to go over some maybe lesser known leaders that some of you might not be aware of, just to kind of put them out there, because I do think they have a place in civil rights movement. Um, Baynard Rustin was a close advisor to MLK, an American leader for the civil rights movement. He had a lot of protests that he led, including the 1963 March on Washington. Claudette Colvin was 15 when she refused to give her seat to a white woman, 9 months before Rosa Parks' similar situation. Colvin was arrested, but she served as a key plaintiff in the case Browder v. Gale, which resulted in bus segregation being deemed unconstitutional. Shirley Chisholm was the first black woman elected to Congress. While in the House of Representatives, she helped expand the food stamps program in New York and in facilitating the Congressional Black Caucus, which exists to this day. Later, she would run for president in 1972, being the first African American having done so. Next, we're going to get into some population data in regards to African Americans. In 2003, they made up 13% of the population, which is likely to be higher today. 80% of African Americans are under the age of 50. 30% are 18 or younger. So, like I said earlier, they are pretty young. And if you look at this chart here, you'll see that white people, in terms of life expectancy, it's been relatively high over the years, and it's only gone up. Whereas black people, it's kind of gone up at a higher rate, but it still remains lagging way behind for the white people, right? Between 2000 and 2019, African Americans only saw marginal improvements to life expectancy. They're the lowest among all ages, one of the lowest. They show an average of 75.3 years to live, whereas Asians had 85.7 years to live, and whites had 78.9. So very staggering and interesting data there. Here are some implications that could be made from what we just went over. Since they're relatively young, they're going to be a very important demographic in the workforce in the future. Organizations should be aware of access and treatment discrimination for the growing population. This should be proactive and concurrent after they're hired. These seminars and training programs that reinforce diversity. In 2019, African Americans made up about 12.1% of the entire U.S. workforce, but they're also underrepresented in health professions, according to one study in 2021. This lack of representation could contribute to the restricted access to healthcare for these minority groups. Next, we're going to talk about education statistics. During slavery, enslaved people were generally not able to get an education. There's a few exceptions, but it was very few and far in between, right? During segregation, blacks had to be educated separately from whites, with some black populations not having any access at all. And when they did have access, they would often be disillusioned by their race. They would internalize the oppression that they see around them, and they would give in to negative stereotypes and start to believe them about themselves, thinking negatively about themselves. This image that I show here below is a very stark representation of that. In 1954, Brown v. the Board of Education decided that black people should be able to enter all public schools. No more segregation, but it was met with resistance. As we continue to discuss education, while the law didn't explicitly require segregation, private institutions and private schools, they could do basically whatever they wanted, and to justify why blacks had to be here, right? Despite constant hurdles, 86% of blacks had completed high school in 2013 compared to 8% in 1940, which is huge. But significant gaps remain. In college education, blacks only have 26.1% of them have degrees compared to 40.2% of whites. Next, we're going to talk about employment and earnings. There is quite a bit here, but blacks do, on the same education level as whites, they're still more likely to be unemployed, and they make less when they are employed. They are significantly more educated than in the past, but the earnings levels and the employment levels have not kept pace at all. The total unemployment in the U.S. was 3% in 2019, but for blacks it was 4.8%, which means blacks were 60% more likely to be unemployed. And studies show that blacks and Latinos were 20% less likely to be hired compared to whites, which contributes to access discrimination. There are also some studies that suggest if you have a foreign sounding name, you're less likely to be hired. So hirees and hirers should keep that in mind. Compared to other groups, black people usually fall under the lowest or the second lowest of earnings. Black women earn 86% of the amount that black men earn, which is the highest among all groups. There are still several lawsuits that continue in terms of discrimination towards blacks. In 2000, Coca-Cola had paid black people around $26,000 less than their white counterparts in the same roles, which is insane. And this segues into some common stereotypes that might lead to some of the statistics that we just talked about. Some people might assume that black women are lazy and that black men are like violent, inherently violent, right? And they might say that whites are like more intelligent than and seek education more often than blacks, which, as we're going to see, is just not true. You see, black women are actually more likely to work outside of the home than white, Asian, and Native American women throughout history, and that continues to this day. While African Americans are nearly 10 times more likely to be victims of homicide than their white counterparts, this is due to a variety of things. One of which could be, racial profiling, right, from the police, and they're more likely to be shot by the police, which counts towards that statistic. And the fact that they're, there's still privatized segregation in a sense, and that contributes to higher crime, and higher crime also includes homicide, right? Blacks are the same education level that have when they have the same education level as whites, they're more likely to be unemployed and earn less when they are employed than whites. So that just contributes to the disparity. Despite all this, black people have continued to fight and show strength. When they are able to self-actualize despite all these barriers, they also win against the battle versus internalized oppression. And when the opportunity arises, black voices, they reverberate the pain of all of their fellow community, giving rise to exceptional leaders like Malcolm X and MLK. And they're generally better at self-regulation. Blacks are constantly reminded of their race and in all facets of life, and they have to do certain behaviors to kind of like regulate themselves so they don't act out of line and be targeted, basically, like showing their hands to police, even if there's no like hostile like situation, right? And exposure to racism is connected with an increased likelihood of African American adults creating coalitions for political and social justice for all groups that ultimately affect all groups, because the Civil Rights Act was not just for black people, it was for all minority groups. African Americans develop social intelligence that better prepares them to detect unfair treatment, hypocrisy by those in power, and inconsistencies between what people do and what they say, according to one study in '98. African Americans, being a non-dominant group, have to persevere in a white patriarchal society. This develops positive coping mechanisms, like a positive outlook and empathy towards others, according to one study in 2016. Here are some strategies that can promote inclusion for individuals, including African Americans themselves. First and foremost, seek an education, higher education if you can afford it, if you have access, because that's generally associated with higher earnings and lower unemployment for all groups. Try to seek employment from firms that enforce affirmative action. These are typically large firms and not small family-run businesses, since they're not required to do it. And while discrimination can be demotivating, being aware of it can reduce feelings of helplessness. Persistence is key, as we've seen throughout history. African Americans should write their initials on applications and resumes so they don't be discriminated against because of their names, as we mentioned earlier. Despite the hurdles, African Americans should continue to pursue entrepreneurship, the American dream. And while sex and race discrimination is illegal, they should use resources that the government provides to help them fight against it, because there are some legal avenues. The fact that things like access discrimination happen before employment and treatment discrimination happens during employment, that happens, it means that leaders need to be proactive and concurrent with training employees about things like diversity and inclusion and education in general. Leaders should be aware of their own prejudices and stereotypes that might lead to certain decisions, right? And try to challenge those. When seeking to hire new employees, leaders should exclude race-biased stereotypes, only consider merit, experience, and the capabilities relevant to the job. Mandate structured and consistent interviews that are the same across the entire organization. Whenever unfair behavior is conducted by others, it should be openly challenged. Nobody should be able to just get away with things like microaggressions that become normalized. Leaders should avoid pigeonholing minorities into certain job roles that they think would fit them better than others, right? As well. With that, we're going to talk about some popular culture depictions of African Americans. As you can see here, this is a pretty recent example on Jemima. She was only recently removed from products, but this image was actually associated from some mammy stereotype, which was basically that black women were muscular, they were not feminine, they were obese and loud, while this image was often juxtaposed with a European white woman that was attractive, and it would kind of normalize this image of this negative stereotype of black women while showing white women as the ideal, right? Very disturbing, and it's interesting how something like that can still pervade into everyday life without people even recognizing it, almost on a subconscious level. What's also interesting about media representation is that African Americans are overrepresented in sports such as the NBA. This overrepresentation of some roles versus others, it actually perpetuates the stereotypes as well in many ways. And with that, I'm going to finish us off with a very relevant quote by Malcolm X. If you stick a knife in my back 9 inches and pull it out 6 inches, there's no progress. If you pull it all the way out, that's not progress. The progress is healing the wound and the blow that was made. And they won't even admit the knife is there. Very, very relevant quote even today. All right, and here are the references. It is going to be 2 pages. I'm also going to try to put it in the description if it fits. What's funny, I actually recorded this entire video and the sound wasn't on, so I had to redo everything. So yeah, that was an interesting experience. Here's the next slide. Thank you again, Dr. Clements. This was for INP 3224 Workforce Diversity. Here's an image of me on vacation. I hope you have a great day. Thank you for listening.